You put it on your eggs this morning without thinking. You've done it every day of your life. You'll do it tomorrow. And you have absolutely no idea that the thing you just reached for without a second thought, that white crystal sitting next to the pepper, once started revolutions, funded empires, built the first trade routes in human history, and got 60,000 people thrown in prison in a single month. You've been treating a world historical weapon like table decoration. Here's what this video is going to show you. We're going to cover 6 turning points in the history of salt, 6 moments where this one mineral changed the course of civilization. And I'll tell you right now, number 3 is going to rewrite the way you think about money. Number 5 is going to make you furious. And at the very end, I'm going to leave you with one question about the world you live in right now. And if you sit with it honestly, it'll change how you see every resource on the planet. Stay until the end. Because the story doesn't finish in ancient history, it finishes in your kitchen. Let's start with biology. Because before salt was political, before it was economic, before it was a weapon, it was biological necessity. Your body contains approximately 250 grams of sodium chloride at any given moment. That's roughly enough to fill a standard salt shaker. And without it, you don't slow down. You don't feel tired, you die. Here's what actually happens when your body runs out of sodium. Your blood pressure drops. Your cells lose the ability to hold water in the right balance. Your nerves stop firing electrical signals the way they should. Severe sodium depletion causes confusion, muscle failure, brain swelling. If you go long enough, your organs shut down. We're not talking weeks. Severe cases can kill a person in days. Early humans didn't have chemistry textbooks. They didn't understand sodium ions or osmotic pressure. But they didn't need to. They had something better. They had eyes. And they watched animals. Deer, elephants, mountain goats, animals across every continent would travel enormous distances to reach natural salt deposits. Hundreds of miles, sometimes, through dangerous terrain, to reach what are called salt licks. Exposed patches of mineral-rich earth where sodium chloride seeped to the surface. African elephants have been documented navigating through pitch-dark underground cave systems, feeling their way along cave walls in complete darkness with their trunks, just to reach underground salt deposits, then scraping the mineral off the rock with their tusks. Prehistoric humans followed those trails, literally. Hunter-gatherer communities tracked animal paths to salt licks and began harvesting the mineral for themselves. This wasn't a small, occasional thing. Some of the earliest evidence of deliberate, organized salt production anywhere on Earth comes from a site in what is now Romania, where archaeologists found salt springs that were being systematically exploited as far back as 6,000 years before the Common Era. 6,000 years BCE. That's older than the Egyptian pyramids by a significant margin. That's older than writing. Humans were running organized salt operations before they had organized anything else. In China's Yuncheng Salt Lake region, evidence suggests humans were collecting salt from evaporated lake beds, possibly as far back as 8,000 years ago. Communities permanently settled around salt sources. Some of the earliest known trade networks in human history, routes connecting distant communities for the purpose of exchanging goods, were organized specifically to move salt from places that had it to places that didn't. Think about what that means. Before money, before cities, before government. Humans were building supply chains for salt. But here's where it gets interesting. Collecting salt from a spring or a dried lake bed is relatively simple. Turning it into a tradable commodity that could be stored, transported, and sold across hundreds of miles, that required something else entirely. It required technology, it required organization. And inevitably, once something becomes that valuable, it required control. This is where salt stops being a story about biology and starts being a story about power. The ancient Egyptians were among the first to fully grasp what salt could do, not just as food, as a technology. They used a naturally occurring compound called natron, mostly sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate, to preserve the bodies of their dead. This was the entire foundation of mummification. The process worked like this. Workers would remove the internal organs, pack the body cavity with natron, and cover the entire corpse in the mineral. Over the following 70 days, the natron drew all the moisture out of the tissues. The result was a preserved body that could last thousands of years. Without salt, there are no mummies. And without mummies, the entire Egyptian afterlife religion looks completely different, because preservation of the physical body wasn't optional in Egyptian belief. It was essential. The soul's survival in the next world depended on it. But preservation wasn't just for the dead. Salt could keep fish and meat edible for months, sometimes years. In a world without refrigeration, this wasn't a luxury. It was the difference between surviving winter and starving to death. Egyptian fishermen along the Nile would pack their catch in salt and store it in clay jars for trade up and down the river. The Romans took this further. They developed a fermented fish sauce called garum, made by layering fish and salt in large stone vats and letting the mixture break down in the sun for weeks. Garum factories operated from Spain to North Africa. It was essentially the ketchup of the ancient Mediterranean world, and it existed entirely because of salt's preserving properties. Here's the strategic reality this created. Cultures that controlled salt could stockpile food, feed armies through winter, and trade preserved goods over vast distances. Cultures without salt were at a catastrophic disadvantage. Salt was the difference between military strength and vulnerability, between a city that could survive a siege and one that couldn't. Halfway around the world, the Chinese had reached the same conclusion independently. Archaeological evidence from Sichuan province suggests Chinese communities were drilling for salt brine as early as 3,000 years before the Common Era. They sank bamboo pipes deep into the earth, pumped up salty groundwater, and boiled it in iron pans to extract crystals. Some of these boreholes reached depths of over 300 feet. That was an engineering achievement that wouldn't be replicated in Western Europe for another 2,000 years. And here's a detail that doesn't get nearly enough attention. While drilling for salt brine, Chinese engineers accidentally discovered natural gas. Flammable gas would sometimes escape from the boreholes. And rather than treating it as a danger and walking away, they figured out how to pipe it through additional bamboo tubes and use it as fuel to heat their evaporation pans. Salt drilling in ancient China led directly to one of the earliest known uses of natural gas as an industrial energy source. Thousands of years before the Western world had any concept of fossil fuels. The Chinese government took notice immediately. By the time of the Han Dynasty, around 200 years before the Common Era, the imperial government had established a complete state monopoly on salt. Private production was banned. The penalty for illegal salt trading was death. Not a fine, death. This wasn't about seasoning. Salt revenue funded the military, built infrastructure, and underwrote the operations of the entire empire. A government minister named Sang Hongyang argued explicitly that salt and iron monopolies were essential to state power, because they let the government extract enormous revenue without directly taxing farmers, which tended to produce dangerous unrest. For the next 2,000 years, the salt monopoly would remain one of the single largest sources of government income in China. Dynasties changed, emperors rose and fell. The salt tax outlasted all of them. The pattern was set. Salt wasn't just a mineral, it was the original instrument of state control. And the Romans were watching. Rome built one of its most important roads specifically to move salt. The Via Salaria, literally the salt road, ran northeast from Rome to the Adriatic coast, where sea salt was harvested through solar evaporation. Roman soldiers stationed across the expanding empire needed salt to preserve their field rations. And according to the ancient historian Pliny the Elder, soldiers were sometimes paid directly in salt, or given a specific monetary allowance designated for purchasing it. The Latin word for that allowance was salarium. You can hear it. Salary. Every time you get a paycheck, every direct deposit, every wire transfer, every payroll stub, you are participating in a linguistic tradition that runs in an unbroken line back over 2,000 years to a Roman soldier buying salt at a market outside the walls of a garrison fort. Your salary is named after salt. Let that settle for a moment, because what that word tells you isn't just an interesting etymology fact, it tells you something about what salt was. It was money. It was value itself. It was the thing that other things were measured against. And we're just getting started. Let's talk about what happens when a government realizes it controls something everyone needs to survive. Not wants. Needs. Because that's a very different kind of power. You can negotiate around luxury. You can live without silk, without spices, without gold jewelry. But you cannot negotiate around survival. And the rulers who understood this, truly understood it in their bones, built some of the most profitable control systems in human history. Salt was the original too-big-to-fail commodity, and the people who figured that out first didn't just get rich. They built civilizations. The Roman salt trade operated through a system of state-controlled salt pans, large, shallow coastal pools where seawater evaporated under the Mediterranean sun, leaving behind white crystalline deposits. The largest operation was at Ostia, Rome's port city at the mouth of the Tiber. Salt harvested there moved up the Via Salaria directly into Rome and then outward to every corner of the empire. Roman armies couldn't function without it. A legion of 5,000 men marching through what is now Germany or Britain or Syria needed preserved food, salted meat, salted fish, olives cured in brine, that could last weeks without spoiling. The logistics of Roman military expansion were, in a very real sense, salt logistics. Remove the salt supply chain and the Roman war machine seizes up. The Romans also understood something that took other civilizations longer to grasp. Salt wasn't just a military resource, it was a diplomatic one. Control the salt supply to a neighboring tribe or kingdom, and you control that territory without ever fighting a battle. Several Roman client kingdoms on the empire's borders were maintained, at least partly, through managed salt access. The empire supplied it. The client kings distributed it. Everyone understood the implicit message: this arrangement works as long as the relationship works. Salt as geopolitical leverage. 2,000 years before modern economic sanctions, Rome was running the same playbook. Now here's what most people don't know about the period after Rome fell. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century CE didn't just end a political system. It shattered infrastructure. Roads deteriorated. Trade networks collapsed. The organized salt supply chains that had connected coastal salt pans to inland cities broke down almost completely. What replaced them was something messier, more local, and far more violent. In the absence of centralized state control, whoever happened to sit on a salt source suddenly had enormous power. Monasteries built near salt springs in Central Europe became some of the wealthiest religious institutions on the continent, not because of their theological influence, but because they controlled access to salt. Cities that developed near natural salt deposits, places like Salzburg in modern Austria, whose very name means salt fortress, grew into major regional powers specifically because of their location. Salzburg wasn't important because of its scenic alpine views. It was important because it sat at the intersection of mountain salt deposits and navigable river routes. The archbishops of Salzburg built their considerable wealth and political power almost entirely on salt revenues for several centuries. The city's famous fortress, the Hohensalzburg, one of the largest medieval castles in Europe, was funded by salt. This pattern repeated across the continent. Wherever salt appeared, power followed. The city of Lüneburg in northern Germany sat above one of the largest underground salt deposits in medieval Europe. For nearly 1,000 years, from roughly the 10th century to the 19th, Lüneburg was one of the most important industrial cities on the continent, not for steel or textiles, but for salt. Its salt was shipped north to preserve the enormous herring catches of the Baltic Sea. Those preserved fish then fed populations across northern Europe through winter. The entire Baltic herring trade, which was the economic foundation of the Hanseatic League, the most powerful trading network in medieval northern Europe, ran on Lüneburg salt. The Hanseatic League, a commercial alliance of merchant cities that at its peak stretched from London to Novgorod. That controlled trade across the North Sea and Baltic for 300 years. That effectively functioned as a proto-nation with its own laws, its own navy, and its own diplomatic relationships with European kingdoms. Built in no small part on fish packed in Lüneburg salt. One underground deposit beneath a German city helped fund a trading empire that shaped northern European history for 3 centuries. That's the scale we're talking about. But the most audacious salt operation of the medieval period belongs to Venice. And this is the part most people have never heard. Venice, by the 9th century, had established itself as the dominant salt trader in the Mediterranean. This was not accidental. The city sat in the middle of a shallow lagoon with ideal conditions for solar salt evaporation. But more importantly, Venetian merchants were extraordinarily aggressive in turning their salt advantage into a total trading monopoly. Here's how they did it. Venice would negotiate with cities on the Italian mainland and eventually across the wider Mediterranean, using salt as the entry point. They would offer salt at below-market prices, sometimes even at a loss, in exchange for exclusive trading rights for other commodities: spices, silk, grain, timber. Once those exclusive arrangements were in place, Venice would gradually raise salt prices. The other city was now dependent on Venetian salt and locked into Venetian trade terms. It was predatory pricing as foreign policy, and it worked for centuries. By the 13th century, Venice had extended this model across the Adriatic and into the eastern Mediterranean. Their salt operations on the Greek islands, in Crete, in Cyprus, combined with their trade control of goods moving between Europe and Asia, made Venice one of the wealthiest cities on earth. Historians estimate that salt revenues funded a significant portion of the Venetian navy. That navy protected the trade routes. The trade routes generated the wealth that built the palaces, the churches, the art, the entire glittering Renaissance city that tourists photograph today. The next time you see a photograph of Venice, the canals, the gondolas, the Doge's palace, you are looking at a city built substantially on the economics of a white mineral. While governments and merchants and city-states were building power on salt, ordinary people were paying for it, in ways that were not small, in ways that were not optional. Medieval salt taxes were not gentle revenue mechanisms. They were extraction systems designed to take maximum value from people who had no alternative. In France, the gabelle, the salt tax, became one of the most hated institutions in the country's history. And it wasn't just the amount of the tax, though, that was crushing. It was the mechanics of how it worked. Under the gabelle at its worst, the French government didn't just tax salt, it mandated salt purchases. Every person over the age of 8 was legally required to buy a minimum amount of salt per year from government-controlled salt warehouses at government-controlled prices. You couldn't opt out. You couldn't grow less of it. You had to buy the government's salt at the government's price, whether you needed that much or not. The mandatory minimum purchase was called the devoir du sel, the salt duty. It was a compulsory purchase of a basic survival necessity, enforced by law, collected by tax agents who had the power to enter homes and estimate salt usage. And the price varied wildly by region. In some parts of France, the tax on salt was 5 times higher than in other areas. The government created artificial scarcity in high-tax regions by restricting supply. People in those regions were not just paying more, they were being prevented from accessing enough salt to adequately preserve food for winter. The gabelle generated enormous revenue. It also generated 400 years of accumulated fury. By 1789, the salt tax represented one of the most visible and tangible symbols of everything broken about the French monarchy. When the revolution came, when the mob stormed the Bastille, when the old regime collapsed, abolishing the gabelle was one of the first acts of the new National Assembly. They didn't abolish it because salt wasn't important anymore. They abolished it because it had become so clearly an instrument of systematic cruelty that keeping it meant keeping everything else that was rotten about the old system. Salt didn't cause the French Revolution, but the fury built around salt, 400 years of mandatory purchases, regional price discrimination, tax agents with the power to enter your home, was structural fuel for the fire that burned the monarchy down. Here's something your history teacher almost certainly never told you. In 1864, the Confederate Army of Tennessee was falling apart. Not just from battlefield losses, not just from outnumbered men or exhausted supply lines. It was falling apart because soldiers couldn't eat. Specifically, because they couldn't preserve food. And that comes down to one thing: salt. Modern armies run on fuel, ammunition, and communications. 19th century armies ran on preserved food. Salted pork, salted beef, salted fish.
Is pure.
Salt pork was so central to the Union and Confederate
Agreed.
soldiers' diet that both armies measured their logistics in barrels of it. A regiment that ran out of salt pork didn't just eat badly, it lost fighting capacity. Men without adequate nutrition don't march well, don't dig trenches well, don't fight well. At the start of the Civil War, the Confederate States faced an immediate structural problem. The South had almost no domestic salt production infrastructure of any significance. The North controlled the major salt-producing regions, the massive deposits under the Great Lakes area, the operations in New York State, the works in West Virginia. In peacetime, the South bought salt from the North and from imports. War ended both of those options overnight. A bag of salt that cost $1.25 in the South before the war was selling for $60 in some parts of the Confederacy by 1862. Not because the war destroyed the salt, but because the supply chain was severed. $60 in 1862 is equivalent to well over $2,000 today. For a bag of salt that families needed to survive winter, the Union understood exactly how critical this vulnerability was, and they exploited it deliberately and systematically. In 1862, Union forces targeted and destroyed the major Confederate salt production facility at Saltville, Virginia, one of the South's most important domestic salt sources. Union raids hit salt works along the Gulf Coast in Florida and Louisiana. The strategy was explicit: destroy the South's ability to preserve food, and you degrade its ability to fight. The Confederate response reveals just how desperate the situation became. Officials scrambled to dig new salt wells. They scraped salt residue from the floors of old smokehouses. They boiled dirt excavated from beneath meatpacking plants to extract whatever sodium traces remained in the soil. Women tore up the floorboards of their smokehouses and ran the salt-saturated earth through makeshift cloth filters to leach out enough mineral to preserve another season's worth of meat. It was never enough. Some historians argue, seriously in peer-reviewed academic work, that the Confederate salt shortage contributed as substantially to the South's military defeat as any single battlefield loss. Logistics win wars. Salt was at the center of Civil War logistics in a way that almost no popular history acknowledges. And then, 68 years later, salt did something even more dramatic. It broke an empire. For decades before that morning in 1930, the British colonial government in India had maintained a complete monopoly on salt production. Not a partial control, not a heavy tax, a total prohibition. Indians were legally forbidden from making, collecting, or selling their own salt, even though salt deposits existed throughout the subcontinent and salt washed freely onto the beaches of their own coastline with every tide. They were required by law to purchase government-produced salt, at prices inflated by heavy taxation. For rural Indians, the majority of the population, subsistence farmers earning almost nothing, this was not an abstraction. The salt tax consumed a meaningful percentage of annual income for the poorest families. It was a tax on biological necessity, enforced by the full weight of colonial law. Mohandas Gandhi had been looking for the right moment and the right issue. He understood something that purely theoretical political strategists sometimes miss. A cause needs to be legible. It needs to be something that requires no explanation to a farmer who never attended school and has never read a political pamphlet. The injustice of being forbidden from picking up a mineral that washed onto your own beach is that kind of legible injustice. It needs no translation. It needs no ideology. Every person who hears it immediately understands that it's wrong. On March 12, 1930, Gandhi left his ashram near Ahmedabad with 78 followers. They were walking to the coastal village of Dandi, 240 miles away on the shores of the Arabian Sea. They walked for 24 days. The march was covered by international press from the beginning. As they moved through villages, thousands joined them. The British colonial administration watched with growing uncertainty. Arresting Gandhi before he reached the sea would create a martyr. Letting him reach the sea would mean watching him publicly break British law in front of the world's cameras. They let him walk. On April 6, 1930, Gandhi reached the edge of the water. He bent down. He picked up a small, natural lump of salt from the mud at the shoreline. That was it. That was the act. It was almost absurdly simple, a 70-year-old man in a cotton dhoti picking up a piece of mud from a beach. And it was simultaneously one of the most perfectly constructed acts of political defiance in the history of the modern world. Within days, the act replicated itself across the entire country. Indians in coastal villages began evaporating seawater. Inland communities began buying illegal salt from unlicensed sellers. The civil disobedience spread horizontally, spontaneously, without central coordination, because no coordination was needed. The act was simple enough that anyone could do it. The British responded with mass arrests. Over 60,000 people were imprisoned, including Gandhi himself. Colonial authorities raided illegal salt operations. They beat protesters at the Darasana salt works, a scene witnessed and reported by United Press International journalist Webb Miller, whose account reached newspapers across the United States and Europe and caused international outrage. Here's the thing about arresting 60,000 people for picking up salt. It looks exactly as monstrous as it is. The Salt March didn't end British rule in India that year, but it broke something that couldn't be repaired: the moral legitimacy of empire. It demonstrated in terms the entire watching world could understand that the British presence in India was maintained by the violent enforcement of rules designed purely to extract money from people who had no political voice. India achieved independence 17 years later. The road from Dandi to Delhi was long, but it started on that beach, all because of salt. Your doctor has probably told you to eat less salt, maybe more than once, maybe with genuine concern in their voice. Maybe you've been cutting back, choosing low-sodium options, checking labels, feeling virtuous about it. Here's what your doctor almost certainly doesn't know: the scientific foundation for that advice, the research that convinced governments around the world to put reduced sodium at the center of dietary guidelines for the last 50 years, was built on a study so methodologically flawed that its own author couldn't replicate it. And the industry that benefited most from the anti-salt campaign spent decades making sure the contradicting evidence never reached your doctor's desk. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented. This is in peer-reviewed journals. The anti-salt movement in modern medicine traces back primarily to one man, Lewis Dahl, a researcher at Brookhaven National Laboratory in New York. In the 1950s and 1960s, Dahl conducted a series of experiments feeding rats extremely high quantities of sodium, quantities equivalent to roughly 500 times the average human daily intake, and observed that the rats developed high blood pressure. From this, Dahl extrapolated a direct causal relationship between dietary salt and hypertension in humans. The extrapolation was enormous. The quantities of sodium he fed the rats had no meaningful relationship to what humans actually consume. But the conclusion, salt raises blood pressure, high blood pressure causes heart disease, therefore salt causes heart disease, was clean, simple, and alarming in exactly the way that tends to generate funding, attention, and policy recommendations. The American Heart Association ran with it. The US government ran with it. Dietary guidelines published across subsequent decades placed sodium reduction at the center of heart health recommendations. Doctors were told to advise patients to cut salt. Food companies began producing low-sodium product lines. A multi-billion-dollar industry built itself around the idea that salt was quietly killing you. But here's what was happening simultaneously in the scientific literature, the part that never made it to your doctor's office. Other researchers tried to replicate the core finding, that reducing dietary salt in humans with normal blood pressure meaningfully reduced their risk of cardiovascular events. The results were, at best, inconsistent. A landmark meta-analysis published in the American Journal of Hypertension, reviewing decades of studies, found that while very high sodium intake was associated with elevated blood pressure in some populations, the relationship between moderate salt reduction and actual cardiac outcomes was far weaker than the official guidelines implied. Some studies found no significant benefit. Several found potential harm, that very low sodium diets were associated with increased cardiac risk in certain populations, possibly because the body compensates for low sodium by activating hormonal stress systems in ways that can damage cardiovascular health. A major Cochrane review, the Cochrane Collaboration being one of the most rigorous independent scientific review bodies in the world, examined the evidence for low-sodium diets and their effect on cardiovascular disease and mortality. Their conclusion was careful and damning. The evidence that salt reduction reduced cardiovascular mortality in the general population was not convincingly established. That review was published. It was largely ignored by public health bodies that had spent decades building campaigns around the anti-salt message. I know what you're thinking right now. You're thinking, if this evidence exists, why isn't it mainstream? Why is my doctor still telling me to cut salt? This is a fair question. And the answer is honest. Part of the answer is genuine scientific complexity. Salt and blood pressure do interact. For people with existing hypertension, particularly salt-sensitive hypertension, which affects an estimated 25% of the population, sodium reduction does appear to help. The question is whether guidelines designed for a high-risk minority are appropriate as blanket advice for the entire population. But part of the answer is also institutional momentum. Once a recommendation is embedded in medical training curricula, dietary guidelines documents, food labeling regulations, and public health campaigns, changing it requires evidence that is not just strong but overwhelming. And part of the answer is industry. Not the salt industry, the food industry. Low-sodium processed food is more expensive to produce because removing salt requires adding other flavor enhancers to compensate. Low-sodium product lines command premium pricing. The anti-salt narrative, paradoxically, has been extremely profitable for large food manufacturers, not because they oppose it, but because they've learned to monetize it. Reduced sodium on a label commands a price premium. It signals health consciousness. It moves product. The current recommended daily sodium intake from the FDA is 2,300 milligrams per day, roughly 1 teaspoon of salt. The average American consumes approximately 3,400 milligrams per day. What is not uncertain, that very high sodium intake is associated with elevated cardiovascular risk, particularly in people who are already hypertensive or have kidney disease. What is also not uncertain, that very low sodium intake appears to carry its own risks. The honest picture looks like a U-shaped curve. Too much is bad, too little may also be bad. The optimal range is wider than official messaging suggests. And here's where it connects to your actual life. Think about a specific person. Maybe it's your father, maybe it's a grandparent, someone who received a cardiac diagnosis and was told firmly, cut the salt. Drastically, low-sodium diet. No exceptions. For genuinely hypertensive patients, especially salt-sensitive ones, that advice may be completely appropriate. But for the millions of people receiving that advice as a blanket recommendation, people who eliminated salt from their cooking, who stopped enjoying food, who added dietary restriction to lives that were already difficult, the evidence supporting that level of restriction is significantly weaker than they were led to believe. There is one area where the science on salt is genuinely clear. It's not about the salt you add at the dinner table. It's about the salt you don't see. Roughly 77% of the sodium in the average American's diet doesn't come from the salt shaker. It comes from processed and restaurant food. Bread, processed meats, canned soups. Fast food, packaged snacks. A single restaurant meal can contain 3,000 milligrams of sodium, more than the FDA's entire daily recommended limit in one sitting. If there is a legitimate sodium problem in the modern diet, it is almost entirely a processed food problem, not a home cooking problem, not a salt shaker problem. Here's a number that should stop you cold. $1. That's what a 26-ounce container of salt costs at most American grocery stores right now. You can buy it at a gas station. It sits on restaurant tables next to the pepper and nobody thinks about it. Now hold that number in your head while I give you another one. In 14th century England, 1 pound of salt cost approximately 1 shilling, the equivalent of a full day's wages for a skilled craftsman. In medieval Mali, at the height of the trans-Saharan trade, salt was exchanged ounce for ounce with gold. Not approximately, not roughly, literally, equal weight, the same scale. Gold on one side, salt on the other. $1 today. A day's wages in medieval England, its own weight in gold in medieval Africa. That gap between what salt was and what it is now is one of the most dramatic commodity collapses in human history. And understanding how it happened tells you something precise and important about how power actually works. By the mid-19th century, 3 technological shifts were colliding simultaneously. The first was mechanical mining. A single operation in Cheshire, England, by the 1870s, could extract more salt in a week than a medieval saltworks produced in a year. Not 10 times more, not 20 times more. 52 weeks' worth of medieval production in 7 days. The second shift was vacuum evaporation technology, allowing producers to boil brine at dramatically lower temperatures, using far less fuel and producing far more consistent crystals far faster. The product got better while the cost went down. The third shift was transportation infrastructure. Railways and steamships collapsed the economics of distance. Before railways, the cost of moving salt overland more than 100 miles often exceeded the value of the salt itself. Railways eliminated that calculation almost overnight. And then came the discovery of what was underneath North America, beneath the Great Lakes region, beneath Kansas, beneath Louisiana and Texas. Salt deposits of almost incomprehensible scale. The Silurian salt deposits underlying Michigan alone, a single geological formation, contain more salt than the entire documented salt production of human civilization up to that point in history. Not scarce, not rare, incomprehensibly abundant. The scarcity that every salt monopoly in history had depended on, Roman, Chinese, Venetian, French, was revealed to be an artifact of limited geological knowledge, not a permanent feature of the world. Picture a woman in medieval France, farming family, 6 children. A husband who works the fields. Every year she has to buy the government's salt. The mandatory purchase. She can't opt out. She can't make her own. The tax agents come, estimate how much salt a family of 8 should need, and she pays what they tell her to pay. Some years, that purchase consumes 15 or 20% of what the family earns, not because salt is inherently expensive to produce, because the government has legally eliminated every alternative. Now transport her forward 500 years. Put her in a modern supermarket. She walks past 47 varieties of salt and picks up a container of ordinary table salt and pays $1. The mineral in her hand is chemically identical to what the tax agents were forcing her ancestors to buy. What changed is not the salt. What changed is who controls access to it. This is the fundamental lesson. Power over people is almost never power over something inherently scarce. It's power over access. And access can be disrupted by technology, by political action, by someone simply deciding that the rules of the system are no longer legitimate. Now here's the part that should make you genuinely uncomfortable. We tend to look at the history of salt monopolies and feel a comfortable historical distance. We think those were primitive systems. We've moved past that. But have we? Consider prescription pharmaceuticals. The molecules that treat type 2 diabetes, that manage hypertension, that control autoimmune conditions. These are not rare. They're not difficult to synthesize. The active compound in many life-saving medications can be produced for pennies per dose at industrial scale. The price Americans pay for those same compounds is often hundreds or thousands of dollars per month, not because the molecules are scarce, because access to them is legally controlled through patent systems, regulatory frameworks, and insurance structures that function, in their economic logic, almost identically to a medieval salt monopoly. The person who can't afford their insulin isn't rationed from a scarce resource. They're being priced out of something abundant by a structure that has legally eliminated cheaper alternatives. I'm not telling you what the policy solution is. I'm telling you to notice the structure. Because the structure is familiar. 10,000 years ago, humans followed animal trails to reach salt deposits. The thing they were following was biological necessity, a need so fundamental that animals would travel hundreds of miles and navigate through complete darkness underground to satisfy it. Every control structure in the history of salt was built on that biological fact. You need this. You cannot survive without this. Therefore, whoever controls this controls you. And in every single case, the control structure ended the same way. Not because salt became less necessary, but because access became impossible to control. Technology, political disruption, or simply the moment when someone decided that the system was so obviously extractive that openly defying it was worth more than complying with it. Gandhi at Dandi didn't change the chemistry of salt, he changed the calculation of legitimacy. And that calculation is always available, to anyone, at any moment. The next time you reach for the salt shaker at dinner, or step over a pile of road salt on a winter sidewalk, or pass the $1 container on the grocery store shelf, take 1 second to understand what you're actually looking at. You're looking at the thing that funded the Roman military and built the Venetian navy. That triggered the French Revolution and crippled the Confederate Army. That gave Gandhi the perfect instrument to begin dismantling the British Empire. You're looking at a mineral that ruled the world for 10,000 years, and then lost that power in about 40. Not because it became less important to human survival, because the world around it changed, and the structures built on its scarcity had nowhere left to stand. That's the history of salt, and it's also a map of how power works and how it ends. Comment below. What resource in your world today do you think is being priced like medieval salt? What is abundant but controlled? Write it in the comments. One word or one sentence. I want to see what people are actually thinking. Share this video with one person who you think would see the world differently after watching it. Not to argue with them, just to show them the pattern. Next week, we're going inside the internal documents of a major food industry organization from 1964. Documents that show the salt question, the fat question, and the sugar question were discussed together as a single strategic problem, decades before any of it became public. They knew, and we're going to show you exactly what they knew, word by word. That video goes up Thursday. Don't miss it.